Hey everyone, today we're diving deep into a story that resonates with so many people across America. It's the story of Morgan, a brave young woman who stood tall against the injustice of racial discrimination within her own classroom. We've all heard about the importance of speaking up, but how many of us have seen what happens when someone actually does? From isolation to empowerment, Morgan's story reminds us that change is possible, but it takes more than just one voice. It's a story about standing firm in the face of adversity and how one person can inspire an entire community to re-evaluate its values. Stick around as we unpack this powerful narrative, and let's talk about how we can all do better in standing up against discrimination. Because this issue isn't just about one school or one teacher, it's about creating real change in every part of our lives. The morning bell chimed, echoing through the halls of Hilton High, marking the beginning of another day. Miss Cindy stood in front of her English class, her gaze sharp as it swept across the room. There was a subtle heaviness in the air, an unspoken tension that seemed to linger whenever she was around. As the last few students filed in, a new face appeared in the doorway. Morgan Sheldon, a black girl with naturally curly hair, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The students turned to look, some with mild interest, others with barely concealed judgment. Miss Cindy's lips pressed into a thin, tight line as Morgan took a seat near the back. "Well, look what we have here," Miss Cindy remarked, her voice syrupy with a false politeness. "A new face in class. I believe you come from some African country. I hope you can handle the demands of our rather advanced curriculum." The emphasis on advanced was unmistakable, a thinly veiled dig at Morgan's ability. Morgan met her teacher's gaze, calm but silent. As Miss Cindy turned toward the whiteboard, the tension in the room thickened, as though everyone could feel the unspoken conflict simmering just beneath the surface. This wasn't just another lesson. It felt like something bigger was at play. The quiet strength Morgan carried collided with Miss Cindy's thinly veiled prejudice, setting the stage for a moment no one could have predicted. Miss Cindy cleared her throat, her eyes narrowing as she glanced in Morgan's direction. "Today, we'll be discussing themes of power and oppression in To Kill a Mockingbird. Who would like to start?" Her gaze moved deliberately around the room, skipping over Morgan's hand, which was confidently raised. She called on several other students, and only after they had spoken did she turn to Morgan with a tight smile. "Well, Miss Sheldon, do you have something to add?" Morgan straightened her posture, her voice clear and unwavering. "I believe the novel illustrates how systemic racism—" "Systemic racism?" Miss Cindy cut in sharply, her voice laced with sarcasm. "I think you're confusing this timeless piece of literature with modern-day political talking points." A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Some students shifted in their seats, while others smirked, anticipating the conflict brewing before them. Morgan held her ground, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk. "With all due respect, Miss Cindy, the racial injustices in the book mirror—" "That's enough," Miss Cindy interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "Perhaps you should focus on interpreting the text as it's written rather than imposing your own perspectives." The room was silent, thick with tension. Morgan's jaw clenched, but she didn't back down. Her silence spoke volumes, a quiet yet undeniable defiance that seemed to unnerve Miss Cindy. The teacher turned back to the whiteboard, ignoring the atmosphere in the room, and wrote, "Now, let's discuss the symbolism of the mockingbird. Who can tell me what it represents?" As the lesson continued, it became obvious that Miss Cindy was intentionally shutting Morgan out. Each time Morgan raised her hand to speak, Miss Cindy's eyes would glide over her, as though she didn't exist. The message was clear. Morgan's voice wasn't welcome in this classroom. The other students started to notice. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others fidgeted, unsure of what to do. The quiet but unmistakable exclusion was unsettling. This wasn't just about a book anymore, it was about something far deeper, a truth that had been quietly festering behind the classroom doors for years. Morgan's refusal to back down hinted at the possibility that, today, that truth might finally come to light. Some students, meanwhile, seemed to thrive on the teacher's attitude, exchanging knowing glances and sly smiles in Morgan's direction. Despite the tension radiating from her rigid posture and the tightness around her eyes, Morgan maintained her poise. Her pen glided steadily across the notebook, documenting every word, refusing to be sidelined. It was a quiet act of defiance, a statement that she would not allow herself to be pushed out or silenced in her pursuit of knowledge. As the class neared its close, Miss Cindy cleared her throat, preparing to deliver an announcement. "We'll be starting a group project," Miss Cindy said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'll be assigning the groups. After all, we wouldn't want anyone to feel left out." The weight of her words settled uncomfortably in the room. Morgan's eyes narrowed, sensing the challenge hidden beneath the surface. She sat up straighter, her gaze meeting Miss Cindy with a silent determination. When the bell rang, students hurried out, but Morgan moved with deliberate calm, gathering her things slowly, not in a rush to leave. As she reached the doorway, Miss Cindy's voice cut through the chatter. "Miss Sheldon, may I have a word?" Morgan turned, her expression carefully composed. "Yes, Miss Cindy?" The teacher's smile was tight, more of a smirk than a gesture of kindness. "I just want to make sure you understand something," Miss Cindy began, her tone sharp. "In this class, we prioritize facts and critical thinking, not personal feelings or agendas. I wouldn't want you to struggle because you can't separate your emotions from the material." For a brief moment, Morgan remained silent, the words hanging between them like a dare. Then, with a calmness that belied the frustration simmering beneath the surface, she responded, "I understand perfectly, Miss Cindy. I'm looking forward to showcasing my analytical skills in our next class discussion." Without another word, Morgan turned and left, her back straight, leaving Miss Cindy watching after her, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. As the days passed, Miss Cindy's fleeting uncertainty transformed into something more deliberate, a cold resolve. She would make sure Morgan knew exactly who held the power in the classroom, no matter the cost. The upcoming class would lay bare her bias and force Morgan to rise to a challenge far greater than just academic. The following week, Morgan stepped into the classroom with her head held high, determined to face whatever awaited her. Miss Cindy, standing at the front of the room, cast a sharp glance her way as Morgan took her seat. The atmosphere crackled with a quiet tension, like a storm waiting to erupt. As the lesson began, Miss Cindy's attention seemed fixated on Morgan, her every move and word under a relentless microscope. "Miss Sheldon, are you chewing gum?" Miss Cindy snapped, her tone slicing through the air like a blade. Morgan froze, her hand hovering near her mouth, though she wasn't chewing anything. "No, Miss Cindy, I'm not—" Morgan started to explain, but the teacher quickly interrupted. "Don't lie to me, young lady. Spit it out now." Her voice dripped with contempt. Morgan's classmates shifted in their seats, some avoiding eye contact, while others watched the scene unfold with uneasy fascination. Morgan rose slowly, her movements deliberate. She walked to the trash can, mimed spitting out the non-existent gum, and quietly returned to her desk. The room was heavy with silence, the tension thick enough to cut. As the lesson dragged on, Miss Cindy's actions grew more pointed, her critiques more biting. She zeroed in on every detail of Morgan's performance, her handwriting, her posture. Sit up straight, Miss Sheldon. This isn't your living room, she barked, overlooking the fact that Morgan sat no differently from the other students. Morgan's frustration was visible in the way her jaw tightened, her fingers gripping her pen. She took a few deep breaths, trying to keep her composure as the teacher's attacks continued. The atmosphere in the class shifted. Students like Annie, seated in the front row, shot Morgan sympathetic looks when Miss Cindy wasn't watching. But others, emboldened by the teacher's behavior, smirked and whispered, enjoying the spectacle. During a class discussion, Morgan raised her hand to share her thoughts. Miss Cindy smiled, though the expression didn't reach her eyes. Yes, Miss Sheldon. Please enlighten us with your unique perspective. Morgan's voice was steady as she began, but Miss Cindy interrupted almost immediately. I'm sorry, could you please speak more clearly? Not all of us are used to certain sense. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the class. Morgan's eyes widened, her fists tightening beneath her desk. The racism, once thinly veiled, was now on full display for everyone to see. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. But before Morgan could leave, Miss Cindy called out, Miss Sheldon, stay behind. We need to talk about your performance. Morgan approached the desk, her heart pounding, though her face remained carefully composed. Miss Cindy looked up, her expression icy. I hope you understand that your attitude is becoming a problem. If you're unable to meet the expectations of this class, you might want to consider finding a more appropriate place. The implication hung heavily between them. Morgan took a deep breath, her voice steady but resolute. I understand perfectly, Miss Cindy. I'll continue doing my best, as I always have. As she turned to leave, Miss Cindy added with a smug tone, Oh, and Miss Sheldon, don't forget, your group project is due next week. I trust you'll be ready. Morgan walked out, her resolve unshaken, though the weight of the confrontation still lingered in the back of her mind. Morgan gave a quick nod, her mind already buzzing with thoughts. She was fully aware that this presentation could be a pivotal moment. Miss Cindy had been waiting for the chance to humiliate her in front of the entire class, but Morgan was resolute. She wouldn't give her the satisfaction. The room felt charged with tension as Morgan stepped forward to begin her presentation. Little did she realize, Miss Cindy had been preparing for this moment, ready to launch her most vicious critique yet. What would unfold when prejudice and authority clashed in front of the whole class? Taking a deep breath, Morgan steadied herself, standing before her peers. She had put countless hours into preparing for this, determined to prove her worth, despite Miss Cindy's continual efforts to undermine her. Behind her, a project board showcased a well-researched analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird, with a focus on racial injustice and moral courage. As Morgan started her presentation, Miss Cindy's eyes narrowed, her lips twisting into a smug grin. She watched like a hawk, her fingers tapping rhythmically on her clipboard, ready to strike. The other students shifted uncomfortably, sensing the palpable tension filling the room. Midway through the presentation, Morgan paused to field questions. Miss Cindy's hand shot up instantly. Miss Sheldon, she purred with a saccharine tone, I'm curious about your choice of focus. Don't you think you're over-emphasizing certain themes? Morgan's brow furrowed slightly, but her voice remained firm. I believe the themes of race are central to the book's message, Miss Cindy. Harper Lee herself said, I'm fully aware of what the author said. Miss Cindy cut her off, her voice sharp. But what interests me more is why you seem unable to appreciate the novel's broader literary value beyond your personal bias. A collective gasp rippled through the class. Morgan's hands tightened at her sides, struggling to keep her composure from crumbling. I don't believe my analysis is biased, Miss Cindy. I've backed up every point with textual evidence and scholarly sources." Miss Cindy stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor with a jarring sound. She marched to the front, positioning herself between Morgan and the rest of the class. "Let me make something very clear, Miss Sheldon," she said coldly. "This relentless focus on race is not only misplaced, but it's also disruptive to the classroom environment. Perhaps your previous school accepted such narrow interpretations, but here we expect a higher level of academic rigor." The silence that followed was deafening. Some students kept their heads down, unwilling to meet Morgan's eyes. Others watched in shock, their faces a mixture of horror and fascination, as Miss Cindy continued her verbal assault. "Furthermore," she added, her voice rising, "your insistence on inserting modern political agendas into classic literature shows a deep misunderstanding of the material. Frankly, I'm beginning to question whether you're truly equipped to handle the curriculum at this level." Morgan's eyes filled with unshed tears, but she stood her ground. "With all due respect, Miss Cindy, I disagree. The themes of racial injustice in To Kill a Mockingbird are as relevant today as they were when the book was written. To overlook them is to ignore the author's intentions." "Enough," Miss Cindy barked, cutting her off. "Your attitude is bordering on insubordination. I suggest you take your seat and reflect on whether you're truly prepared for the standards of this class." Morgan slowly began to gather her materials, the weight of humiliation pressing down on her shoulders. Just as she turned to sit, a quiet voice piped up from the back of the room. "I thought Morgan's presentation was really good." Miss Cindy whirled around, her eyes blazing. "And what exactly do you know about literary analysis, Mr. Peterson? Perhaps you'd like to join Miss Sheldon in detention to discuss your academic shortcomings." The student shrank back, silenced. Miss Cindy turned her icy gaze back to Morgan, who remained frozen by her desk. "Well, sit down so we can move on to presentations that are actually worth our time." Morgan sank into her seat, her face burning with a mix of anger and shame. She could feel the stares of her classmates, some sympathetic, others gleeful at her downfall. The injustice gnawed at her, but she forced herself to breathe deeply, calming the storm inside. As Miss Cindy called the next student to present, Morgan's mind raced. She couldn't let this continue. But what could she do? The teacher had all the power, and speaking up would only lead to further humiliation. For now, she would have to endure. But inside her, a quiet determination began to stir. This wasn't over. Just as she resolved to bide her time, the classroom door swung open. Miss Cindy looked up, a sly smile creeping across her face. "Class," she announced, her voice syrupy with false kindness, "I have an important announcement." Morgan's heart pounded, a mix of dread and resolve surging through her. She knew her father would defend her, but the idea of him confronting Miss Cindy filled her with anxiety. The class exchanged glances, some curious, others uneasy about what would come next. "I've arranged a meeting with Miss Sheldon's parents after school today," Miss Cindy continued, clearly enjoying herself. "I'm sure they'll be quite interested to hear about her disruptive behavior and inadequate academic performance." As Miss Cindy spoke, the rhythmic sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Steady, purposeful, and growing louder with each passing moment, the entire classroom seemed to hold its collective breath, sensing something significant was about to happen. The steps stopped just outside the door, and a brief pause hung in the air, thick with anticipation, before a firm knock broke the silence. Miss Cindy's brow creased ever so slightly, a clear sign of her irritation at being interrupted. "Come in," she called, her tone sharp with annoyance. The door opened smoothly, revealing a tall man in a well-tailored suit. His presence was commanding, immediately drawing the attention of the students. A ripple of recognition swept through the room. It was Mr. Sheldon, the principal. Morgan's eyes widened, her face a mixture of surprise and relief. She glanced over at Miss Cindy, who remained oblivious to the connection between her new visitor and the student she had singled out earlier. Mr. Sheldon entered the room with a calm authority, his gaze sweeping over the students before briefly resting on Morgan. A flicker of concern passed between them. He then turned to face Miss Cindy, his expression neutral but carrying a quiet strength. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything too important," he said, his voice smooth but firm. Miss Cindy straightened up, forcing a professional smile onto her face. "Not at all, Mr. Sheldon. We were just wrapping up a discussion on To Kill a Mockingbird. Is there something I can assist you with?" Mr. Sheldon nodded slightly, his eyes now focused solely on her. "Actually, there is. I understand you've requested a parent-teacher conference regarding one of your students." Miss Cindy's smile grew wider, clearly pleased by the apparent validation of her authority. "Yes, that's correct. I believe it's important to address some issues before they escalate further." "I see," Mr. Sheldon replied, his tone carefully neutral. "And which student would that be?" Miss Cindy turned, gesturing dismissively towards Morgan. "Miss Sheldon, actually. No relation to you, of course." Miss Cindy chuckled at her own assumption, oblivious to the tension building in the room. She assumed, since Mr. Sheldon was Asian American, there couldn't possibly be any family ties. Mr. Sheldon's expression barely shifted, but the slight raise of his eyebrow suggested something deeper. "Is that so?" he said calmly. "Well, Miss Cindy, I think we should continue this conversation in private." Miss Cindy, eager to have her complaints heard, quickly agreed. "Of course, Mr. Sheldon. I'd be happy to share my concerns about Miss Sheldon's performance and behavior." As Miss Cindy gathered her materials, Mr. Sheldon addressed the class. "Students, continue with your reading. This won't take long." He offered a reassuring glance to Morgan, a subtle smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The gesture was quiet but powerful. Morgan sat up straighter, feeling a spark of confidence she hadn't felt in weeks. Miss Cindy, still unaware of the gravity of the situation, led the way out of the classroom. Mr. Sheldon followed, but not before casting one last look back at his daughter. The glance they exchanged spoke of shared understanding and strength. As the door clicked shut behind them, the room erupted into excited whispers. Students leaned over their desks, speculating about what was happening just beyond the door. Morgan remained silent, her eyes fixed on the closed door, knowing that beyond it, justice was finally being set into motion. The muffled sounds of conversation from outside the classroom gradually grew louder. Miss Cindy's once confident voice began to falter, giving way to uncertainty as Mr. Sheldon's calm yet authoritative tone filled the air. It was clear her assumptions were unraveling. They walked down the hall to a conference room. Miss Cindy's heels clicked sharply against the floor as she turned to face Mr. Sheldon, still wearing that same smug smile. "I appreciate you taking the time to discuss this, Mr. Sheldon. I've been quite concerned about Morgan's behavior and her academic performance." Mr. Sheldon nodded, his face unreadable. "I see. Please, go on." Miss Cindy launched into her complaints, her voice growing more animated with every sentence. For one, she constantly challenges the curriculum. She inserts her own views into discussions, completely derailing the lessons I've planned. Mr. Sheldon's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. "And her attitude," Miss Cindy huffed. "She disrupts class with her personal opinions. Just today, she gave a presentation on To Kill a Mockingbird that completely missed the point. She focused entirely on racial themes and ignored the book's broader literary merit." Mr. Sheldon raised an eyebrow. And you find it inappropriate to focus on racial themes in a novel centered around a racially charged trial. Miss Cindy froze for a moment, caught off guard by his question. Well, I believe we ought to prioritize the universal themes rather than getting entangled in specific issues, Mr. Sheldon said, his tone calm and measured. And could you explain exactly how Morgan has been disruptive? Can you provide concrete examples? Miss Cindy straightened up, regaining some of her composure. Of course. She constantly raises her hand to challenge points I make in class. She debates with other students during discussions, and her body language. She sits there, all defiant. It's clear she has no respect for authority. As Miss Cindy spoke, Mr. Sheldon's expression shifted, his eyes hardening ever so slightly. Yet his voice remained even. Miss Cindy, let me ask you something. Have you considered that what you interpret as defiance might actually be a student engaging in critical thinking? Miss Cindy blinked, momentarily thrown off by the question. I hadn't thought of it that way, but Mr. Sheldon, you need to understand, this girl just isn't a good fit for our school. Her previous education must have been inadequate. Perhaps she would do better in a different environment. Mr. Sheldon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I see. And what makes you think Morgan's previous education was inadequate? Well, isn't it obvious? Miss Cindy responded, her voice dripping with disdain. The way she talks, her focus on certain topics, it's clear she hasn't been exposed to the level of academic rigor we maintain here. Mr. Sheldon took a deep breath, his calm demeanor betraying nothing of the growing tension beneath the surface. Miss Cindy, I believe it's time I clarify something. Morgan's previous education was outstanding. In fact, I can personally vouch for it. A frown creased Miss Cindy's forehead, confusion flickering across her features. I don't understand. How could you possibly know that? Mr. Sheldon's gaze sharpened, locking onto Miss Cindy. I know because I'm Morgan's father. The color drained from Miss Cindy's face as the weight of Mr. Sheldon's words sunk in. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. The smug confidence that had carried her through the conversation dissolved in an instant. You're, she stammered, her eyes widening with shock and mounting dread. Mr. Sheldon nodded, his expression stern. Yes, Miss Cindy. Morgan Sheldon is my daughter. My wife is an Angolan Republican, and I've been listening very closely to everything you've said about Morgan. Miss Cindy stumbled backward, her hand reaching out to steady herself on the edge of a nearby desk. The full realization of what she had done, the biases she had unwittingly revealed, and the fact that she had laid them bare to both the school's principal and a father, crashed over her like a tidal wave. Mr. Sheldon, I had no idea, she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. Clearly, Mr. Sheldon responded, his tone heavy with the weight of the moment. But ignorance is no excuse for the way you've behaved. Not only have you shown clear prejudice against my daughter, but your comments reveal a troubling pattern of discrimination that goes far beyond a single student. Miss Cindy's thoughts were in a whirlwind, scrambling for a way to redeem the situation. Mr. Sheldon, please let me explain. I never intended— But Mr. Sheldon raised his hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. I believe you've said enough, Miss Cindy. There will be a more in-depth conversation about this later. For now, I suggest you head back to your classroom. We wouldn't want to keep the students waiting, would we? Miss Cindy, still in shock, nodded silently and turned toward the door. But before she could exit, Mr. Sheldon spoke again. Oh, and Miss Cindy, I'll be sitting in your class for the rest of the day. I'm quite eager to observe your teaching methods firsthand. His words were calm, but they carried a sharp edge, hinting at the turmoil simmering underneath. As Mr. Sheldon followed her into the classroom, a shift in the atmosphere was immediate. The students straightened in their chairs, sensing the tension filling the space. "Class," Mr. Sheldon began, his voice steady but with an unmistakable firmness. "Today we need to discuss something of great importance: respect, diversity, and the true meaning of education." Miss Cindy stood stiffly beside her desk, her earlier confidence now completely gone. Her gaze darted between Mr. Sheldon and Morgan, the weight of her recent revelation still pressing down on her. Mr. Sheldon continued, sweeping his gaze across the room. "It has come to my attention that some troubling incidents have occurred in this class, incidents that run counter to the values this school upholds." A collective gasp rippled through the students, and a few glanced toward Morgan, piecing together what was unfolding. "Miss Cindy," Mr. Sheldon said, turning back toward the teacher, "would you care to explain to the class why you felt the need to consistently demean and belittle one of your students?" Miss Cindy's mouth opened, but no sound came. She struggled for words. "Mr. Sheldon, I didn't mean—" "Didn't mean to what, Miss Cindy?" Mr. Sheldon's voice sharpened, his composure beginning to fracture. "Didn't mean to make racially charged assumptions about a student's background? Didn't you mean to dismiss valid perspectives simply because they didn't conform to your limited view of the world?" The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and Miss Cindy's silence only deepened the sense of unease in the room. The students sat in stunned silence, watching as their typically composed principal underwent a transformation right before their eyes. His words were sharp, deliberate, and exposed the injustices that had been quietly brewing in their classroom for weeks. "Let me make this clear," Mr. Sheldon said, his gaze fixed on Miss Cindy. "Your treatment of Morgan, and I suspect of other students of color, is not just unprofessional, it's profoundly damaging. You've fostered an environment where students are afraid to share their thoughts and experiences." Miss Cindy attempted to respond, her voice shaky. "Mr. Sheldon, if I could just explain—" "Explain what exactly?" Mr. Sheldon interrupted, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Are you going to explain how you belittled Morgan's interpretation of To Kill a Mockingbird because she focused on its racial themes? Or how you've consistently ignored her raised hand during class discussions? Perhaps you'd like to explain your comment about her previous education being lacking just because she doesn't fit into your narrow expectations." Miss Cindy's face turned pale as Mr. Sheldon continued to recount her actions. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but all she found were stunned, disappointed faces staring back at her. Mr. Sheldon turned his attention to the rest of the class. "Students," he began, his voice steady, "understand this. Education is not about silencing voices or dismissing perspectives that challenge our own. It's about broadening our understanding, engaging in respectful conversations, and learning from each other's experiences." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. "What you've witnessed here isn't education. It's discrimination, plain and simple. And it ends now." The room was thick with tension. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in silent agreement. Morgan sat quietly, her eyes glistening with tears of relief and vindication. Mr. Sheldon's gaze returned to Miss Cindy, who seemed to wilt under the intensity of his scrutiny. "Miss Cindy, your actions reflect a clear and consistent pattern of discrimination that goes beyond just one student. This behavior is completely unacceptable, and it will be addressed appropriately. For now, I will be taking over your class for the remainder of the day." As Miss Cindy hastily gathered her things, her movements were jerky, and it seemed like the full gravity of the situation had finally dawned on her. She cast one last, desperate glance around the classroom before hurrying out the door. The silence that followed her departure was deafening. Mr. Sheldon took a deep breath, visibly calming himself before speaking again. "I'm sorry you all had to witness that, but it's important that you understand this. Prejudice and discrimination have no place in our school or in our society." He moved to the front of the classroom, his posture relaxing slightly, though his voice remained firm. Some students looked shell-shocked, while others appeared relieved. A few glanced apologetically at Morgan, the weight of their quiet complicity hanging heavy in the air. Mr. Sheldon cleared his throat, gathering the class's attention once more. "I realize this has been an intense and emotional experience for all of you. We'll be bringing in a counselor to help process everything that's happened here. For now, class is dismissed early. I encourage you all to take this time to reflect on what you've seen and think about how we can all work together to create a more inclusive and respectful environment." As the students slowly gathered their things and filed out of the room, there was a palpable shift in the air, a recognition that something important had just happened and that the responsibility for change rested with all of them. As the students began to leave the classroom, many paused to offer words of encouragement to Morgan. Annie, who had always quietly occupied a seat at the front, approached with a tentative air. "I'm sorry I never spoke up," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I knew what was happening wasn't right, but I was too scared to do anything. It won't happen again." Morgan gave a soft nod, her lips curving into a small, understanding smile. "Thank you, Annie. Speaking up is never easy, but it's the way we start to change things." Outside the classroom, the news spread like wildfire. Small groups of students gathered in corners, whispering about what had transpired. As Morgan stepped out, walking beside her father, the hallway fell silent. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the crowd. It started with a few students but soon grew, echoing down the corridor as more joined in. Morgan walked with her head held high, the fear and isolation that had gripped her for weeks dissolving into a newfound sense of empowerment. Her classmates weren't just seeing her, they were acknowledging her strength and determination. Meanwhile, in the administrative office, Miss Cindy faced the consequences of her actions. The school board held an emergency session, and within hours, the decision was made. By the time the final bell rang, marking the end of the day, Miss Cindy was escorted out of the building by security, carrying a cardboard box filled with her personal belongings. Students watched from windows and doorways as their former teacher made her way to her car, her career in education effectively over. It was a somber moment, a reminder that actions come with consequences. The next morning, as Morgan approached the school, she noticed an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The same students who had once avoided her now greeted her with smiles and friendly waves. In the hallways, she overheard conversations about upcoming diversity workshops and the formation of a cultural awareness club. When she walked into her English class, now temporarily being led by a substitute teacher, she was met with welcoming faces, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the room in previous weeks. The air was lighter, infused with a newfound sense of mutual respect. During lunch, Morgan found herself surrounded by classmates, eager to hear her ideas on how to make the school more inclusive. The conversation flowed effortlessly, with suggestions ranging from diversifying the curriculum to establishing mentorship programs for students from underrepresented backgrounds. For the first time, Morgan felt truly seen and valued, her voice contributing to a broader conversation. As the school day ended, Morgan walked out with her father, passing by the now empty parking spot where Miss Cindy Carr had once been. Mr. Sheldon gave his daughter's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You know, Morgan," he began, his voice thoughtful, "what happened here wasn't just about one teacher or one classroom. It's a reminder that change is possible, but it takes courage to speak up and stand against injustice." Morgan nodded slowly, her face contemplative. "I just hope it makes a difference beyond today," she said. "There are so many others who face this kind of thing every day, both in and outside of school." The events at Hilton High had laid bare the prejudice that could exist even within a place of learning. Miss Cindy's treatment of Morgan had uncovered deep-rooted biases that had remained unchecked for far too long. Yet Morgan's bravery in speaking out had set in motion a wave of change. The school community rallied to create a more inclusive environment, implementing new initiatives, diversity training, and fostering open dialogue that challenged old assumptions. Both students and teachers were forced to confront their own biases and reflect on their blind spots. Morgan's journey from being marginalized to becoming a leader showed the power of resilience in the face of adversity. Her willingness to turn personal pain into a force for positive change inspired others to take a hard look at their beliefs and behaviors, proving that standing up for what's right has the power to transform an entire community. Wow, what a journey Morgan has been on. Her strength, courage, and ability to rise above adversity is truly inspiring. Stories like hers remind us that speaking up, even when it's hard, can lead to real change. Whether it's in schools, workplaces, or communities, it takes all of us working together to create a more inclusive and understanding world. If this story touched you, be sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how you've faced challenges in your life or seen positive changes from standing up for what's right. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story like this. Together, we can keep the conversation going and continue to make a difference. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.